television becomes an important part of life beginning in about the 1950s. It becomes widely available to the American public in 1948. And the Federal Communication Commission strongly controls the television industry. This time is often known as the golden age of television because of its rapid expansion. We start to see a large number of television shows and different kinds of television shows. You can see a list here that include Milton Berle, Lucille Ball, Edward R. Murrow, and various quiz shows. Also, because of this, other industries are spurred on. TV begins to have some social effects on Americans as well. Women, for example, often appear on television as the perfect homemakers. Males are represented far more often, about a 3-to-1 ratio, and of course very few minorities are seen. So television portrays an ideal America with no poverty or racism, no struggles. And we do, however, start to see the first programming concerns, including concerns about violence and qualities of programming. We also see a series of quiz show scandals, and we can talk about those in class. Radio continues to prosper. As you know, it became very popular in the 1920s and 30s and continued to be popular through the 1950s. There was lots of local programming, and it was just easier to listen to and less expensive than movies. So movies struggled, but it did have several advantages. Now movies are available in stereo sound and in color, and the first 3D movies come out. Another aspect of culture in the 1950s is the arrival of the Beatniks. Some people just don't want to go along with this whole issue of national conformity. Those involved in this movement are called Beatniks. They're involved in, quote, the Beat movement. These are social and literary nonconformists living mostly in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Greenwich Village, and New York City. They're concentrated in urban areas, and they live a very non-material lifestyle, shunning regular work. So they are, for the most part, artists who work when they want and when they can find work. And this sets a precedent for the hippie generation. This is a life with very little structure. And it clashes with regular America, or conformist America. It's described as exactly the opposite of how America was trending. Another kind of rebellious cultural aspect was rock and roll. Alan Freed coined the term rock and roll. And rock and roll music brings black and white people together. We start to see an increasing number of rock and roll musicians, including Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Bill Haley, Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, of course. Many make their first appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, which is a variety show. It has entertainment of all kinds, but often featured a musical group. Another popular show was Dick Clark's American Bandstand. The reaction to rock and roll music was great because teenagers loved it and adults hated it, which made teenagers love it that much more. Despite all of this prosperity, still 1/4 of Americans are living below the poverty line. That is what is needed to survive comfortably. The Other America is a book that comes out in the 1950s describing the poverty that exists during that time period. We also see what's called white flight. This is millions of middle-class whites moving to the suburbs, while a lot of rural poor move to the inner city to try to find work. The loss of tax dollars from the middle class hurts the city, hurts city services, kind of brings the inner city down, and we have an increase of impoverished people trying to find work in the middle of cities. This is when we see the first urban renewal efforts, HUD being the initial movement. It works to improve inner city and help the poor that live there. Also, another kind of downside is that women in America were paid less in their roles in the work world, and they were also restricted to certain jobs. If you decided you wanted to work outside of the home, you were restricted to certain types of work. Still, we see more women attending four-year colleges. So the role of the woman is very conflicting. You have an image of women being portrayed as the perfect housewives, good to their children and their husbands, and good consumers, and yet they are not happy with this role. Many of them are getting four-year educations and want to do more with their lives than be housewives. Betty Friedan wrote about this phenomena in The Feminine Mystique. This was the beginning of the women's liberation movement because it discussed the discontentment of women. We also see large numbers of people immigrating from Mexico. They are still needed to harvest crops, and they had been used and greatly depended on during World War II. Many stayed, but stayed as illegal aliens. And they, as they continue to today, face discrimination in all areas of the nation. We also see Native Americans who struggle for equality and independence. They're finally given their citizenship in 1924. And the Indian Reorganization Act, passed by the government, moves away from the process of trying to assimilate Native Americans and moving towards letting them govern themselves and receiving less and less, quote, help from the U.S. government. We'll end with some general characteristics of the 1950s. I'm not going to read through these. You can take a minute and read through them yourselves. But they all are characteristics of this time period. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in class.